Well, welcome everyone to the first brown bag for this calendar year here at the Humanities Center. I'm Jamie Goodrich, the director of the center, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Diane Cress, who will be giving a talk today on the subject of demon metal or essential nutrient, cobalt. And I have to say, I'm really excited about this. But before we let her speak, I'll go ahead and introduce her, and then we'll begin. Diane has been faculty in the Department of Nutrition and Food Science since 2008. She is a registered dietitian and has a PhD in nutrition. Prior to obtaining her doctorate, Diane worked as a clinical dietitian in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and returned here to her home state where she got her doctorate and worked as a bench scientist for nearly 2 decades. The focus of her work in the lab was to investigate the impact of dietary factors on lifespan and cancer. More recently, Diane has initiated work that allows her to share nutrition information with the public on a wide range of nutrition-related topics. In part, this aspect of her current work is driven by the glut of bad information constantly presented to the public, but even more importantly, she finds the sharing of knowledge obtained over the past 30 years to be rewarding, relevant, and important. Everybody eats, but not everybody has access to knowledge of how food makes the body work. Her goal with this work is to write a popular science book using storytelling that brings science to life and to the public. Welcome. We look forward to this talk.
Thank you for having me. I am really excited to have this opportunity to talk to the people who are here and the people who are on Zoom and the people who will hear it later by the recording. I'm kind of using this as a bit of a focus group. So the project I'm working on straddles a line sort of between human interest stories and science. And I'm trying to find that line and where the comfortable place is. So this presentation is pretty text heavy, as I was just explaining a minute ago, because I want you to see and think about what I'm talking about and jot down notes as they occur to you while we're going through. And then I would ask you a favor to hold those thoughts until we're done so that the stories can develop and I can make the connections. But I'm really hoping to get a lot of feedback and just, whatever pops into your mind, jot it down, even if it doesn't seem to make sense. I would love to hear about it later. So next slide, please. So some time ago, and I'm a little embarrassed to say how long ago, my daughters gave me a writing box, and it was full of things that were intended to encourage me to do this project. And in this box was this emergency pack deck of cards that included this card, which is, if there's a book that you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. And that's from Toni Morrison. And that's sort of where I was. I kept looking for this information. I kept thinking, wouldn't it be great if these stories existed? And they don't. And so here I am trying to do this project. And it is now in a place where it never intended to be. I've gone into a lot of different rabbit holes and down a lot of different questions and topics. And somehow I've landed on this question of cobalt. And so having gone that far off, it won't hurt us to go a little further. Let's say back to the 17th century and to the mines in Germany to talk about how cobalt got its name to begin with. So next slide, please. So cobalt got its name because it is the German word for goblin, which is cobalt. And I'm going to read you this quote from the US Geological Survey. Deep in the dark mines and forests of Germany, in the days long before electricity, when flickering torchlight made shadows come to life, whispers told of mysterious and ominous creatures waiting to prey on the hapless and unaware. One of these, the cobalt, was a particular bane of German silver miners, poisoning their silver ore so that the metal that emerged was mere powder, not the lustrous ingots they sought. The cobalt even poisoned their bodies, making them wretched and sapping their strength. The miners cursed the cobalt, or sometimes even made offerings to the cobalt to stave off its mischief, but to no avail. Next slide, please. So from that quote, the cobalt even poisoned their bodies, making them wretched and sapping their strength. How? How is it that cobalt does that? So this is where now there's the story, the human story of the miners and how they got sick and how they gave presents to these goblins in hopes that that would spare them. Of course, it didn't. Now is the science of, well, what did the cobalt do? How did it make them sick? And so some of the things that we know are that inhaling cobalt dust causes some pulmonary toxicity. So if you look at this slide down here, I don't know if you can see me pointing at that, but this is a giant cell interstitial pneumonia. This is the primary type of lung toxicity that occurs from inhaling cobalt dust. And then these pictures represent, or pictures of, I guess, contact dermatitis from actually touching the cobalt. You might be familiar with the concept of nickel having this effect, because sometimes jewelry and clothing has nickel in it. It's the same concept of the that contact dermatitis on the skin. So you could see how if you were a minor and you came out with lesions like this on your skin that hurt and burn and itch as well, you might pray to those goblins and leave them gifts so that they would leave you alone. And then there's no real picture for this, but another symptom of long-term cobalt exposure is neurological tremors, confusion, memory loss, and convulsions. And that's going to come back into play quite a bit throughout this talk today. All right, next slide, please. So from this book, The Demon Haunted World, and that is just a coincidence that he uses the word demon. It is not a book about cobalt. Carl Sagan gives us a lot of advice on why we think about things the way we do sometimes. And the gist of it is that when we don't know the whys about things, when we don't have the knowledge, our brain does fill in gaps in our knowledge with information that we do have, maybe magical, superstitious, maybe made up ideas like something like goblins and demons in the mines. And the point of this is that science is really an incremental process that lifts us out of darkness. I use those words because the subtitle here is Science as a Candle in the Dark, that lifts us out of darkness and towards understanding. And we're constantly making new discoveries as science evolves and technology improves and perspective grows. And I don't mean to suggest at all that we have all those answers now. There are still a lot of gaps in our knowledge, and we fill in those gaps until we have information that tells us, how the world is actually working. An example I like to use is this thing that scientists used to call the luminiferous ether, not really different from the goblins and demons. Scientists didn't understand how light as a wave could move if it didn't have a medium to move through. So they just made up this thing called the luminiferous ether, and everybody agreed that that's how light moved until Einstein's special theory of relativity told us or showed us that you don't need a luminiferous ether. It doesn't exist. So that's an example of how a scientific discovery lifted us out of dark and helped us understand. And we're constantly expanding our knowledge when it comes to science. One of the problems is, and I'll get to this a little bit later too, and he deals with this a lot in this book. I highly recommend this book. One of the problems is, as we try to understand and learn and progress the science, we find that we're becoming less and less able to do so because we don't have the scientific knowledge that we need to have in order to do that. So that's part of the purpose of this book, is to help popularize science and get people interested and get people to know and understand a little bit better. So assuming the absence of any actual demons in those German mines, what was actually happening? And we could do the next slide, please. Well, mineral ores are, it's a little hard for me to see that, are rocks containing various minerals. So the metals that you want out of the earth, they don't just exist as silver or cobalt or aluminum. They exist in these big hard rocks and the conglomerations of a bunch of different metals. And so you need to extract those metals from the ores and from each other. And that takes extreme heat and various chemicals that are crushed and ground and heated. And then hopefully those metals get separated out so that you have the one that you want. Well, in the silver mines, they wanted silver, but they had to get the cobalt away from the silver. And we know that when it comes to cobalt, when they were doing all of this to get the cobalt away from the silver, toxic fumes were created. It was toxic to the touch, and it was also very difficult to separate out. So the next question I want to address is what makes cobalt so difficult to separate from the other metals? So now, next slide, thanks. And the answer to that question does boil down to chemistry, and that brings me to Sylvia Plath. I knew chemistry would be worse because I'd seen a big card of the 90-odd elements hung up in the chemistry lab, and all the perfectly good words like gold and silver and cobalt and aluminum were shortened to ugly abbreviations with different decimal numbers after them. So ugly as those abbreviations may be, and ugly as those decimal points may be, we have to understand them. Because, and this is back to Carl Sagan again, we live in a complex age where many of the problems we face can, whatever the origins are, only have solutions that involve a deep understanding of science and technology. So we have to understand why not just cobalt, everything, but in the case of what we're talking about today, why cobalt behaves as it does. And that requires us to understand chemistry. And that means we're going to talk a little bit about electrons too. So if we could have the next slide. So here is the periodic table of elements. I hope you remember it a little more fondly than did Sylvia Plath. As you probably recall, this table is set up so that we begin with the lowest atomic number and proceed towards the highest. And these are probably the 90 elements that she was referring to. We now know that we have more than 90. And the point of this is to organize these elements in a way so that we can understand a little bit about them based on where they are here. And what we see, and I've circled here, cobalt, nickel, and copper, and also silver, because silver is what they were looking for, right? But also along with that silver were these elements that they had to get rid of, and cobalt that we're talking about particularly. What you'll notice about these three is that they're all pretty close to each other. And what that tells you a lot of things, but one of the things it tells you is that they're fairly similar. And that's one of the things that makes it difficult to separate them out. Another thing you'll notice is that these are all blue. The blue elements are transition elements or transition metals, and cobalt is one of these transition metals, as are nickel, copper, and silver. So some of the things about transition metals are that they are good Lewis acids, which means they readily accept electrons from many sources around it. And another really, important factor about cobalt here is that it has d electrons that are available for bonding, a lot of bonding. There are 18 of them. And they are very high in energy and they are very reactive. An analogy I tried to come up with, and I don't think it's a very good one, would be like, imagine you were holding hands with your friend and you each had 2 hands so you could make those 2 bonds. But now imagine you were each an octopus and you had 8 hands to hold, and now you have those 8 bonds, and how much harder that would be to pull you apart. So now imagine 18 of them. And if my daughter's class is watching, she asked me to mention to you that electron counting is a little bit different for the transition metals, and she wants you to know, or wants me to say, that the octet rule does not apply here. So the gist of electrons, I gave you some specifics here, but the gist is that the number and distribution of electrons is what determines its chemical behavior. And that's what determines why, or what explains why it's so hard to get cobalt away from the silver and away from those other metals. So I already kind of mentioned that. If we look down here, this is sort of materials chemistry we're talking about now. The chemical similarities to these other transition metals makes the separation based on differential properties nearly impossible. So a lot of separation strategies in the lab are based on differences in weight, differences in charge, for example. They aren't different, they're similar, hard to get them apart from each other. And the other is, let's go back to that sort of awkward octopus analogy I made, but if you've got all those d electrons and all those coordinate bonds that have been made, it's hard to break and it complicates separation. So the harder it is to break, the more heat you have to add, the more caustic agents you have to add, the more fumes, the more toxic, the more demon and the more goblin that metal is going to be. Okay, next slide, please. So this is a word cloud to sort of show you some of the thoughts and ideas and pretty much how my brain has a lot of these thoughts and ideas organized right now to tell and develop from these ideas stories that pull together the science and the human interest and the human stories, really, to make a story that has a lasting impact and that that helps people remember the science behind the story, right? If there's a story behind the science, then it's easier to remember. It's a great way to learn. So some of the stories in here that I teased you with in the abstract are like, is cobalt the reason Matisse lost his ability to hold a paintbrush? Is the use of cobalt in beer an explanation for why people died from goiter, why we had this goiter epidemic? Or why is it that this critical organic molecule made from this inorganic metal, cobalt, why is that so essential to our life? And when we destroy it or interfere with it, why do we develop anemia or neurological symptoms? Why Does nitrous oxide have those same effects? How do cobalt and vitamin B12 come together in this conversation? So those are some of the things I'm going to try to talk about today. And what I want to do now is pick up where we left off, but 400 years later, and instead of in the mines of Germany, we are now in the mines of Cobalt, Ontario. And we're going to talk about how that gave the world Toronto and the Montreal Canadiens. Next slide, please. So Cobalt, Ontario is named Cobalt, Ontario because this geologist, Sir William Edmund Logan, in 1984 discovered that there was cobalt in the rocks in this region. And so the town was named for that discovery. He didn't discover cobalt itself. He discovered that there was cobalt there. And so this area is the Timiskaming district in Ontario. You can see it up here called Cobalt. Let's see, Toronto's got to be down here somewhere, and then here we are in Detroit over here. This area had a population of about 100 people in 1902, but in 1909 that had increased 2 orders of magnitude to 10,000 people. What happened? And what happened was silver. This became the birthplace of Canadian hard rock mining and a ton of extraction of metals, predominantly silver, from those hard rocks. So let's talk about that a little bit. Next slide, please. In 1903, the silver rush began in cobalt. It was, I like this, it was discovered in the region in 1903 during the building of the Timiskaming and Northern Ontario railways. Never mind that Indigenous peoples had been cultivating silver and copper in that region for over 6,000 years, but it was really discovered in 1903. That's another story, very interesting story. And it was not hard to discover. They had an area called the Silver Sidewalk because there was so much silver in the land and it was up near the surface that it literally, you could literally see the silver in the land. It was not hard to discover. How much silver was it? It was a ton of silver. One of the largest silver producing areas in the world, over 13 million kilograms of silver was produced from this area. That's over $16 billion in today's prices, and over 34 mines developed in that area. Well, you can't get all that silver out of the land, you can't develop all these mines, and you can't make all this money for all these mine owners without bringing a lot of people into the area. So that's why all the people came into cobalt, was to get the silver out of the land. And it's truly a story of ecological and human abuses at the hands of wealthy mine owners. It's a story that has repeated itself through history over and over again. And it's a story worth knowing, I think. So if we could look at the next slide, please. If you are at all interested in this story, I very highly recommend this book, Cobalt, the Cradle of Demon Metals and the Birth of a Mining Superpower by Charlie Angus. And this is Charlie. And one of my goals in this project is to eventually drive myself out to Cobalt and meet Charlie and interview him, because he just seems like the most interesting person. But he is a politician. He's been a member of the House of Commons since 2004. He's also a musician and songwriter. He is currently in a band called the Grievous Angels, which is an alt country band, but was previously in a punk rock band called L'Étranger. And I just kind of really want to meet this person. So 2 quotes from this book I'd like to share with you are, after all of that 10,000 people came in, and then basically 9,000 of them left after it was all done. What remained was the detritus of a great war against the earth. It is hard to get the metals that you want separated from the mineral ore. We've talked about that already. It was in the 16th century. It still was in the early 20th century. And guess what? It still is now. We'll talk about that a little bit in a few minutes. The process was brutal to the land and to the people. But as you might expect, and this is all detailed in this book, the mine owners didn't care about the land. They didn't care about those 10,000 people who were abused and misused. They cared about getting silver out of the land and making money. Literally, that demon was still there. The chemistry of cobalt and human nature haven't changed and won't change. And then the interesting thing is, this wasn't just about silver. So this quote from the book also, Cobalt elevated a new financial elite who quickly learned that the real riches of the northern mines were not to be found with a pick and shovel, but by mastering the financial alchemy of hustling, mining plays, and manipulating the stock market. So I'm about to explain to you how we got Toronto out of all of this. So next slide, please. Toronto becomes an economic powerhouse. It becomes the financial center of this rapidly growing resource industry. It had until that time, and this probably surprises us because we probably love Toronto, but it had been a laughingstock of sorts, sort of a train stop on the way to somewhere better. And it transitioned as a process of all this mining and exploitation from a backwater sort of one-horse town into a financial hub. They started working out out of the King Edward Hotel, they called the King Eddie, but eventually built the Toronto Standard Stock and Mining Exchange. And the type of financing that was happening there was, if you've watched The Wolf of Wall Street, you're familiar with the term pump and dump. That was the type of financing that was happening. Penny stocks and speculation. And the other thing that these people did was encourage the government to be really lackadaisical in their oversight, and they were. So people were not protected from the work in the mines, they weren't protected from the conditions in Cobalt, and they weren't protected from being taken financially as well. And the people who were being taken were not the wealthy people, they were the people who could ill afford to lose money. Not that different from what you see in casinos, really. Okay, next slide, please. And then I love this story. It also got us the Montreal Canadiens because, you know, wealthy cobalt mine owners needed to entertain themselves. And of course, they're Canadians. So what would they entertain themselves with besides hockey? So they built themselves an arena. It held 3,500 spectators. And what I love is it included this glassed-in tea room so they could watch the hockey game from the warmth and comfort of this glassed-in space. The local team, I bet I don't even have to tell you, you could have guessed their name was the Cobalt Silver Kings. Yes, it could have been the Cobalt Silver Barons as well, but they were the Cobalt Silver Kings. And here's how the story goes. In 1909, the Stanley Cup winners, who were the Montreal Wanderers at the time, they came into town to play the Cobalt Silver Kings. And by the accounts in the book, the game was brutal. And not only was the game physically brutal, but these cobalt mine owners had manipulated the rink to make it 40 feet shorter and 30 feet narrower than a traditional hockey rink. So this team, this Stanley Cup winning team, the Montreal Wanderers, came in and didn't have any idea how to play on this tiny little rink, and they lost 6-4. Well, that just gave them a taste for more. And these mine owners started plucking players from other teams around the country, Canada and Michigan, really, by luring them with promises of silver riches. And they came because who doesn't want silver riches? So what happened is, as they pluck all these great players, is they continued to win. And so they present themselves to the Stanley Cup Consortium to compete for the Stanley Cup, and they are denied. They do not get to compete for the Stanley Cup. Well, wealthy mine owners will not be denied. And so they created their own league. They said, well, if you're not going to let us play for the championship, we'll create our own league. And that was the National Hockey Association. Teams in that league included Cobalt, Haileybury, the Montreal Wanderers, the Renfrew Millionaires, and the Montreal Canadiens. So here we get to the point of the story finally. The NHA was established in 1909, but it was unsustainable. They couldn't keep paying all the players all this money to get them to come. It was too expensive, not sustainable, and eventually became absorbed into what became the NHL. And the only team to survive to this day is the Montreal Canadiens. But you probably never knew that they got their start playing against the Cobalt Silver Kings as an amusement for the Cobalt Silver Barons. All right, next slide, please. So back to the science a little bit. If it weren't for the particular chemistry of cobalt, there might be no Montreal Canadiens, and Toronto might still be a mere train stop on the way to somewhere better. But how relevant is this story? Most of us are not miners. We're not working in the mines. We're not exposed to cobalt. But what else can expose us to cobalt? The list is longer than this, but I put these 5 things up here. Beer foam, anemia treatment, pigments. Those can all lead to ingestion or inhalation of cobalt dust or cobalt itself. And then also, I'm not going to talk about this, so they're not highlighted blue, but metal on metal implants can cause cobalt toxicity. And also there's some issue with current day miners, and I will mention that briefly later. So we've already talked about some of the cobalt toxicities, and that includes inhalation of that cobalt dust, which is toxic to the lungs, the topical irritant, which is toxic to the skin, and the neurological symptoms. But also, if you ingest cobalt, and why would anyone do that when we know all of these things, but we didn't necessarily know all of those things. If you ingest it, it can cause nausea, vomiting, and abdominal pain, and chronic ingestion can lead to cardiomyopathy and goiter. And I'm going to talk a little bit about goiter, but first I'm going to talk about beer foam and anemia. So next slide, please. All right, so anybody who enjoys beer knows that a proper head on a beer improves the taste and the aroma of the beer. And the basic way in which that works is, you know, that there's carbon dioxide in your beer and in the cup too, right? The bubbles rise to the top of the glass and sit as that head on the top of the beer. The longer the bubbles last, the sturdier the foam is, the better the taste and aroma of the beer. So that's desirable. Some of the things that can impact the stability of that foam on your beer are ionic charge and low surface tension. The strength of molecular attractions in the liquid allow for better, let's call it bubble stabilization. So this is an example of how you could teach students about ionization and surface tension and molecular attractions within the context of beer. So there's a story that drives home the point in a way that probably improves retention of that material. So once upon a time, oh wait, sorry, let me get back here. Ions stabilize the foam head by improving the gas liquid interface. So the gas is the bubble, the liquid is the beer. As a transition metal, so now think back to the periodic table we were looking at, cobalt provides ions. So if you were to put cobalt sulfate into an aqueous solution, into beer, it will ionize into cobalt with a 2+ charge and the sulfate with a 2- charge. Those ions are what's going to stabilize that foam head and give that beer improved taste and aroma. And so once upon a time, cobalt was used to improve the stability of beer foam. But what happened was people died, and not just a few of them, quite a lot of them died. So there was an epidemic of what is called cobalt-induced goiter and cardiomyopathy in the 1950s through the 1970s. And if we look at this case here in 1966 in Nebraska, there were 64 cases of goiter and 34 fatalities. It also happened in Quebec and Minneapolis. And there was a 46% mortality rate. Now, all of the cases were associated with cobalt sulfate, but largely in men who drank beer daily, often up to 24 pints a day and who were malnourished. 24 pints of beer a day is a lot of beer a day. So that begs the questions, well, is it a function of the beer in the amount of beer? Is it a function of the dose of cobalt sulfate? The more beer you drink, the more cobalt sulfate you're consuming, right? Is it a function of the malnutrition? Because anyone who drinks 24 pints of beer a day has, for a variety of other reasons, some pretty important nutritional issues, malnutrition issues. Or are the sickly more prone to the effects of the cobalt sulfate? So a lot of open questions there. I don't have the answer to that. We don't need an answer to that because the discovery that cobalt sulfate was the cause immediately put to a stop the use of cobalt sulfate to make your beer taste better. So we'll get back to this question of, are the sickly more prone to the effects of cobalt when we talk about Matisse shortly. But first I want to talk a little bit, I think anemia is the next slide. Yes, so anemia used to be treated with cobalt chloride. So cobalt sulfate was used for the foam in the beer. Cobalt chloride was used to induce erythropoiesis. And it actually worked quite well. So let me give you a little bit of background. Anemia, as I'm sure you're aware already, means that there are low numbers of red blood cells in circulation. And when there are not enough red blood cells in circulation, the body responds by making more red blood cells. That's very logical, and that's exactly what happens. Because those red blood cells carry oxygen to your tissues, right? And so that's why when you have anemia, you have a lack of oxygen delivery to your tissues, you feel tired. So there is, I'm going to get into a tiny little bit of biochemistry here, but there's a molecule called hypoxia-inducing factor, and it uses a metal to sense and respond to oxygen needs that will stimulate the kidneys to produce a hormone called erythropoietin, and that stimulates red blood cell production in the bone marrow. So you have not enough red blood cells, you have not enough oxygen. This metal senses that you don't have enough oxygen, so the kidneys make this hormone that tells the bone marrow to make more red blood cells. Now you have more red blood cells, you'll have more oxygen carrying, and that solves or fixes or cures the anemia. Usually iron is the metal that works with this hypoxia inducing factor to do all of that, to affect all of those things. And as I'm sure you're aware, iron is definitely a bona fide treatment for certain types of anemia. But what became understood was that cobalt chloride could have an even stronger effect than iron did. And what it seems to do is displace the iron because it has a more stabilizing effect on that hypoxia inducing factor, HIF, and it amplifies the response to low oxygen. This process is called mismetallation. It displaces the function of one metal in a key cellular process with another. And transition metals are really very good at this trick. So using cobalt instead of iron to fix the anemia situation, fixed anemia, but it also had other problems because that mismetallation wasn't selective only for that reaction. So let's talk next about why cobalt resulted in thyroid dysfunction and goiter. Yes, next slide. So we just explained that cobalt increases erythropoietin production, and that's great for anemia, but it also decreases thyroid hormone production. And I won't go into the details or mechanisms of that, but essentially it decreases hormone production and can compete with thyroid uptake of iodine. Well, the effect of that is you have reduced thyroid hormone production, both T3 and T4. And when you have low thyroid levels, the gland, the thyroid gland, which is in the neck, tries to compensate for those low levels by making more, but you can't make more without the iodine. You can't make more without the hormones that you need. And so that's what we observe as goiter, much like a muscle that's trying to work. When that gland is trying to work where it normally would look like this, it enlarges, and that's what we observe as goiter. And then not only, nobody wants that, but also that means you're not getting the function of the thyroid, which is critical for all sorts of metabolic processes. All right, next slide, please. So those are ways in which we could have ingested cobalt. Now let's get back to the potential inhalation of cobalt and talk a little bit about pigments. So in this wonderful book called The Secret Lives of Color, Kasia St. Clair gives us this quote: "The search for more and brighter colors is fundamental to the story of art from prehistory to today. And that search is not without risk." And you've already been predisposed to understand that. Well, there's cobalt, people breathing that in, that's not good. We know it's not good for their lungs. We know it's not good for their skin. But is this really a thing that happens? And I'm going to just briefly mention here, we all know that there are three primary colors that theoretically you can mix to give you an infinite color palette, but the more you mix it, the murkier the color becomes and it loses its luminosity. So artists really do spend a lot of time trying to find pure pigment because you get better color. We probably all know from our own stories as children, when you mix colors too much, you keep mixing and mixing and mixing, eventually you end up with like a brown, right? Okay, so next slide, please. So pigments were made by hand, which meant you were contacting poisonous raw ingredients. So let's talk specifically about cobalt blue, which was that beautiful blue I had on the previous slide. It's a pigment that's made by heating cobalt 2 oxide with aluminum 3 oxide at 1200 degrees Celsius, creating cobalt aluminum oxide. That is the compound you have when you see that beautiful color. How do you make that? Well, you dissolve the cobalt oxide in hydrochloric acid to form cobalt chloride. Then you mix it with aluminum oxide and the cobalt ions react with aluminum ions, causing the cobalt aluminum oxide to precipitate, which is to form a solid up out of the solution. Then you wash that precipitate, dry it, and heat it to 1200 degrees Celsius. That causes a chemical reaction that transforms the precipitate into that cobalt blue pigment. Once it's cooled, that cobalt blue compound is ground into a powder for use as a pigment. Now you can paint with it, right? So in The Secret Lives of Color, the book I had on the previous slide, she says, in search of the perfect color, some have paid a steep price. So a question that I started developing, as I was looking at cobalt, I was like, well, what artists worked with cobalt? And the one that rose to the top was Matisse, for a variety of reasons that we'll go into in the next couple of slides. So the question is, in the case of Matisse, was his search for that perfect blue or the other perfect colors that he liked to use, was that price that he paid his ability to hold a paintbrush and to paint? I'd also like to point out that safety precautions in the early 20th century were minimal to non-existent. So today we would know to wear a respirator, to protect ourselves from inhaling and touching these toxic chemicals and elements. They didn't know that then. So we know that Matisse was passionate about color. What I'm still trying to understand and learn is, did he do his own mixing? And I'm not certain on the answer to that yet, but we'll work through some of that together here. Next slide, please. So in 1901, he began working with very vivid colors, one of which was very definitely cobalt blues. So studies looking at the pigments in his artwork definitively tell us that. You can see that in some of his works from the early 1900s here. You can see the blues here. You can definitely see the blues here. But by 1930, his doctor had said to him, you can't use paintbrushes anymore. He had such severe nerve damage in both of his arms. And that's what began his career of painting with scissors when he did the cutouts. So the question is, why then do I suspect that cobalt was the cause of this nerve damage? We don't know if he did his own mixing with cobalt. We know he used cobalt. You know, was he exposed to the toxic effects of cobalt? So we know he used it. We know that safety precautions were absent. And what I haven't shared with you yet is we know that his medical history supports that possibility. So next slide, please. So he was born in 1869 and died in 1954. So he lived a relatively long life, but that entirety of his life, he was sickly. He had very severe insomnia from early childhood. He had disabling chronic pain. I've already mentioned by 1930, he was suffering from severe nerve damage in both of his arms, pretty famously described in a lot of different writings. In 1941, he had a GI tumor surgically removed that left him essentially bed and chair bound for the remainder of his life. And the surgeon who removed that tumor, in his notes, said his skin and bones looked to have been affected by long-term exposure to cobalt. In addition, he had respiratory infections yearly. So a lot of the story of his medical history is certainly consistent with having been exposed to cobalt and having cobalt been potentially at least part of the story for his medical symptoms. It's a little bit circular, but there is no, at least I haven't found yet, but I'm still trying to understand better. No definitive evidence that his health problems were caused by cobalt, but significant documentation to suggest that it was a contributing factor to his poor health. And then, as with those beer drinkers, perhaps because he had always been sickly, maybe he was more susceptible to the effects of exposure than some of the other artists who were also using those pigments and colors at the time as well. Okay, next slide. Just briefly, because I can't bear to not mention it. So now we're in the 21st century and we are still mining and we are still putting people at risk for the effects of mining cobalt, except now we're not looking for silver. Now cobalt is the valued mineral, right? And we see the story being played out for artisanal miners in the DRC. These are horrific stories. There is definitely a story to develop here, alongside the science of why cobalt is essential for lithium-ion batteries. So this is another story I'll be developing in the future. Okay, next slide, please. So let's get back to demons and cobalt as this demon metal. Let's talk a little bit about Socrates and Plato, because they describe demons as neither inherently good nor inherently bad. Rather, they were somewhere between what they would have called God and man. And this is really appropriate to a conversation about cobalt, because cobalt has both good and bad, as everything does. Things aren't quite so dichotomous or just evil and good. So let's shift now to some of the good that cobalt does. And some of the things you need to know are, without it, we would die. We would not survive. It is the element at the heart of a very complicated molecule that's essential for DNA synthesis, for red blood cell synthesis, and for proper nerve function. And it's made for us, vertebrates, through a seriously complicated series of reactions by bacteria, using cobalt in its coordination chemistry. Next slide. And what we're talking about here is cobalamin. It's also known as vitamin B12. And the gist is cobalt is the inorganic form and vitamin B12 is the organic form. It is found naturally in foods from animal sources only. It is scarce in the diet, but we only need a very little, and it's critical. We would not live without it, as I already mentioned, making red blood cells, synthesizing DNA, and proper nerve function. So I think I'm running a little bit short on time, so I'm going to go a little bit quickly through this. We need bacteria to make this cobalamin. So next slide. I'm not going to go through all of this other than to show you, here's cobalt, this is cobalamin. It takes bacteria, we need bacteria, a single-celled organism to make this really complex molecule for us. This really complex molecule that, that we can't live without, and that does some really incredible coordination chemistry, which I'm going to skim over on the next slide. But another story here I want to develop is why have we evolved this mutualism between bacteria and us to give us this really critical element? What was, like, why did that happen that way? So that's another story that hopefully is coming. So yes, no, that's good. That's good. What makes cobalt the metal that works here? And I'm not going to, here's the periodic table again, now just signaling out cobalt. I'm just going to tell you that by virtue of its electron structure, it can form stable complexes with many different ligands, and it can form cobalt carbon bonding. So I'm going to use those two examples to explain one of the only two reactions that vitamin B12 does for us in the body. We would die without it, but it only does these two things. So I want to show you how the chemistry of cobalt allows the action of this enzyme to happen. Next slide, please. And I know I'm racing through this, but I want to have more time to chat. So in this reaction, what's happening in the methionine synthase reaction, what's happening is this molecule is facilitating the transfer of a methyl group, a CH3, a methyl group, to homocysteine to create methionine. And in order for this molecule to do that, cobalt has to be able to make a bond with a nitrogen atom in the enzyme, a sulfur atom in the enzyme, a nitrogen atom in this molecule itself, it's this one right here, a water molecule, and that methyl group that we're moving around, that's the whole point of this reaction. It has to form that bond too, and it has to form a bond with a sulfur atom in the substrate, which is the homocysteine. So all of those things happen because of the electrons and chemical properties of cobalt. So that's all I'm going to say about that. And then if you don't have cobalt because you don't eat it, or if something interferes with it, you become B12 deficient. Next slide. So B12 deficiency and cobalt toxicity look a lot alike. I'm going to talk briefly today about nitrous oxide and tapeworms as potential sources of B12 deficiency, but all of these other reasons exist as well. And I'm just going to mention that the reason B12 deficiency and cobalt toxicity look a lot alike is because cobalt can interfere with B12 function through a process called competitive inhibition. Not going to go into that today, but that is another story, another science explanation that fits into this story. Okay, next slide, please. So Sir Humphrey Davy was a famous chemist that we know isolated potassium, sodium, barium, strontium, magnesium, and calcium. Sometimes he's credited with discovering chlorine, but he didn't. And he was this incredibly imaginative, enthusiastic, and immensely attractive young man. People came in hordes to see him speak. He was so dynamic and just, people just loved him. And he ended up becoming a glum and lonely old man because he began using nitrous oxide as much as 3 to 4 times a day, 4 to 5 times a week. Here's how he described those experiences. These are his words. A thrilling extended from the chest to the extremities was almost immediately produced. I felt a sense of tangible extension, highly pleasurable in every limb. My visible impressions were dazzling and apparently magnified. I heard distinctly every sound in the room and was perfectly aware of my situation. By degrees, as the pleasurable sensations increased, I lost all connection with external things. Many did and still do use drugs to expand consciousness. The problem became he used it too much. And the issue with that is, next slide, please. Nitrous oxide interferes with the function of B12. It basically prevents it from doing those two reactions in the body that it's responsible for. So nitrous oxide abuse results in vitamin B12 deficiency, not because you didn't eat enough B12, but because you've destroyed what you had. And this has become a really serious public health problem. And the neurological effects of nitrous use are directly related to the neurological effects of vitamin B12 deficiency. And our own Scott Bowen here has done quite a bit of work in the last couple of decades on the effects of inhalants, and it's a significant public health consideration. So here's another story to develop about vitamin B12 and cobalt and how this drug abuse causes neurological problems because you've destroyed the vitamin. Okay, next slide, please. Another way to destroy the vitamin is to have parasites living in your intestines. I love this picture. I don't know how you feel about it, but if you consume raw fish or undercooked fish, you can become infested with this parasite. I'll show you another picture on the next slide. And two things can happen. The parasite can eat the B12 for itself. So even if you eat it in your diet, this guy gets it instead of you. But it can also dissociate the B12 from intrinsic factor. So I've written another story about how B12 is absorbed. It's a pretty complicated process. That story involves my dog Scout, who you see right here, and I'll leave that for another day. So there are two mechanisms by which these parasites can make you become B12 deficient and then develop the anemia of B12 deficiency and the neurotoxicity of B12 deficiency. You usually find these parasites in the northern hemisphere and in freshwater fish, salmon, trout, perch, and walleye. So next slide, please. They can grow up to 30 feet long. Most of them don't, but it's really impressive to tell you that. This is the primary guy. I can't find my words right now. The one that would be in these fish that would infect you. Diphylloborthrium latrum, if I've said that right. And like I said before, you get those by ingesting undercooked or raw fish. And that's why it's called, when it uses up the host's vitamin B12, you know, it's a parasite. This is not a synergistic relationship. That parasite is in there taking from you what it needs, and it doesn't care what happens to you. But what happens to you is you become anemic and you can develop neurotoxic symptoms. All right, next slide, please. Now, I don't want to leave you without telling you that this molecule cobalamin, which does all those wonderful things that I've sort of tried to touch on here, is also an antidote for cyanide poisoning. So I'm sure you've heard of cyanide. It is a lethal poison. It interferes with the ability of the electron transport chain, and B12 is an antidote. And it's the chemistry that lets us understand why B12 is an antidote. So you look at cobalamin here, here's the cobalt, this R group. So in biochemistry and chemistry, R just means different things can be substituted here. Two of those things, and there are more than two, can be a cyano group or a hydroxyl group. So if you give cobalamin with a hydroxyl group here and you give it as hydroxycobalamin, then the cyanide can swap that out and it will bind there, and then it will be excreted in the urine. Just for your information, most of the B12 supplements on the market are in the form of cyanocobalamin, so that wouldn't work. You need hydroxycobalamin for this to work. And also, as an aside, most of the water-soluble vitamins that you take are excreted out in your urine. All right, next slide, please. So leave you with this thought. Following that horrific injury that left him chair and bed bound in 1941, Matisse is said to have reported that he felt reborn in his art and enjoyed an unprecedented freedom of mind. He wasn't bound by the rules of art that had bound him before. And I kind of draw a parallel to academia. We are, at least I feel, really fortunate to have been afforded the space to pursue a project like this and to be able to follow sort of the things that I wonder about. And so again, if I've made you wonder about anything, or if you have any thoughts or comments, I really want to hear those, even if it seems unrelated or silly. I mean, my whole project has been on unrelated things that have drawn together as this sort of disjointed story that hopefully made a little sense. And I just want to show off a little and share that that's where I'm going to be on Sunday with my daughter who's flying in from Colorado to see the game with me. All right, thank you.
Thank you. We will open the floor for conversation. We have a lot of people online. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand or put something in the chat. Questions?
Can I say something then?
Yeah.
If you have thoughts, you don't have to share them now. You can shoot me an email. You can put it in if they put it in the comments here, I would see them later.
I think
Or
we
not.
can
Or an
get a
email would
copy
be
of them
better.
to you, yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question. How did you get to this story?
It started as thinking I wanted to use stories to teach, right? So a lot of Oliver Sacks and other scientists who have used stories to teach, right? And then I started thinking, well, what stories am I going to tell? What am I going to teach? And that somehow got to metals. I was going to write this book on metals. That gave me a little shape and structure. And then I started with Cobalt because I had already written that story on B12. And I thought, well, I'll start with Cobalt. And I had no idea how much stuff, I mean, what I tried to share with you today is just a tip of the iceberg of some of the things that I've come across. I'm like, maybe I have a whole book just on cobalt. Like, I don't know. So that's how I got here. Other metals I would like to write about include iron and zinc and probably lead, even though that's not a nutrient, it's more like an anti-nutrient. It fits into those transition elements. So maybe, so that's how I got there. And I often think things like, well, if on another day I had had a different thought, I would be somewhere completely different right now, but probably equally as interesting to me anyways.
Yeah, I have some interesting observations that related to cobalt and the beer foam on the top. In the US, if you go to a bar, if the bartender give you a glass of beer with a lot of foam on the top, you probably will not be very happy, right? They will.
You're right.
And so when we were in Munich, we were in a beer garden, and I noticed all the beer have a lot of foam on the top. And so I asked the bartender, why is that? And he said exactly to keep the flavor longer. And
I mean,
so
neither you or I are going to argue that the Germans know more about beer than we do, right?
yeah, I assume so. But I was just very interesting that then he said, oh, the US did all wrong. So if we don't use cobalt, I know I saw a bartender shake a beer can to produce that bubble. So now the beer in Europe, they don't use cobalt, I assume.
Nobody uses cobalt anymore. There are lots of other ways to get the foam, to get that foam, the use of surfactants or the use of other ions that won't poison your thyroid. But
okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yep.
See, Elena had a question and we'll go to Christine online. So we'll start with Elena.
Hi, Diane. So the story you're describing started with that B12 piece that was wildly popular that you wrote during COVID. Is that right?
It started long before that, but it formulated into this because of that. Yes.
So I was just thinking structurally, that for a general audience, I wonder about flipping, and maybe this is weaving together a bunch of stories. They're all so fascinating. And I mean, as somebody interested in environmental history and toxicity and mines and silver in particular, I took tons of notes. I'm interested in every single story that you told. But I was just wondering about the way into this story for the general public. And that story of the vital importance of B12 seems so critical. It's a little hard to understand. I mean, I know you were rushing through the last parts, but
Yeah, that's what happened.
understanding that bit first, in some ways draws us in to understand that this is something just crucial to life as we know it.
Almost
but-
like I buried the lead.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Which I mean,
You
I
wrote that
like to
down,
actually
right?
write that way
Yeah.
sometimes. But I'm just thinking that that is the hook, right? That we can't live without this thing, but too much of it applied the wrong way. And I think, this is actually something I'm working on in my own research, the whole, the dangers of some of the sustainability, discourse, so the lithium ion battery, limits toxicity, unsustainable conditions for the workers who are creating these sustainable practices. That all seems like there's the historical past, but there's that future oriented part, which seems really.
So my problem is, I have many problems, but the problem around this is, like, when I think, oh, the story is like, you could have a whole book on miners in the 17th century, the 20th century, the 21st century. What was life like for them? What were their other choices in the world? What's life like in the DRC now? What are their other, they don't have other choices. That's why those children and people are climbing up those hills and digging cobalt out of the hills, right? So that's not my area. Like, I can't begin to write about that. So to your point, lead with the thing that I know and that I'm an expert in, and bring those stories in instead of the other way around. I like that. I like that
And
suggestion.
that's something that, as somebody who also follows lots of things down lots of rabbit holes, in my environmental humanities stuff, I return to the question, wait, what are you actually an expert in? So like for me,
Sometimes my answer is nothing.
Yeah,
I feel that
right.
way. Yeah. So for you, I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
No. I mean, I go back to the films. I mean, film analysis is really what I know. And then I follow it in all of these directions where I can create the conversations, but sort of rooted in my expertise. But
Yeah.
So I just was curious about even more of that nutritional detail.
I like that idea a lot. I'll ask you again.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
I think Christine is next.
Hi, I definitely learned a lot today.
Oh,
Uh,
thank Christine for the Demon Haunted World. She's the one who told me to read that book, by the way.
so I didn't know anything about treating anemia with cobalt chloride. And I was wondering if it's any kind of anemia or is it just megaloblastic anemia due to vitamin B12 deficiency?
That is a really good question to which I do not have an answer. So did you write it down?
Yes, I did. And my second question is sort of related to Elisa's point. Are there any animals that are capable of making their own vitamin B12 in their gut by their gut bacteria?
The answer to that is yes and no. So technically no, but ruminants do it because of the bacteria in their stomachs make B12. That's how we get it. We get it from the ruminants, right? But they don't make it. It's not their biochemistry that makes it. It's the bacteria in their gut that makes it. Is that what you're asking?
Yes, exact. Yes, that's what I was asking. But we cannot make it. Our own bacteria doesn't make it.
Our own bacteria does not make it. We need at least 2 stomachs, I guess. I don't know.
Okay.
But that's another story to follow. I think that's a really interesting story. Like, how do we, not just the evolution of why does it work that way, but how does it actually work? Because we don't eat the bacteria, right? So I think it's a really interesting question to follow.
Thank you.
Looks like Alyssa has a question online.
Yeah, so one thing I thought of, just kind of with the kind of growth of veganism and I don't know if there's a way to tie that in as well. And
Absolutely.
what are vegan B12 supplements made from? Is it just like in a petri dish, basically like bacterial, or presumably I would guess?
Is the point that you're making that if you're vegan, you don't want something that's bacterially synthesized?
No, I think that would be fine because I think otherwise literally they die. But I was just curious, like
I'm sorry.
like like I'm assuming it is like, truly not animal based. I'm just curious like how that's actually produced.
There's a lot to the answer of that question, and I have some of the bits and pieces, but not all of them. But like one example of plant-based eaters looking for B12 supplements is the what do you call the seaweed?
Nori?
Nori, yes, and it's just not a good source of B12 for a variety of reasons, but that's one of the stories I would follow. Is that an acceptable or appropriate way to get B12, and what can you do as a vegan or as a plant-based eater? Like, there's nothing you can do if you won't have it bacterially synthesized. Oh, Alyssa, where are you when I need you? The other Alyssa, my daughter.
Oh.
Can we synthesize B12 completely synthetically? And I don't know the answer to that, and I should. So that goes on my list of things to find out. But that would definitely be a part of the story. And back to Elena's point about making sure I keep tying in what's my strength, which is the nutrition. I couldn't have this story without talking about plant-based eating and veganism and B12. Yeah.
That's super fascinating.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I think we're a little bit past our time, but we have time for one more if anybody has a question. Oh, yeah.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Diane. Going back to the question about the EV cars, I don't know
About
if
what?
the EV, the batteries in a.
Oh, yeah.
How much cobalt is in there? Like, for example, Tesla, how much cobalt it has, and when these cars catch on fire, is there any concern that they might get into the air? And because I haven't seen any sign. A lot of time with respect to batteries, there's a little sign of dangers or caution, but I never thought that the cobalt will be, I know that it's the new diamond, I guess, because of how rare it is, but.
Yeah, and not just cobalt, there are other metals too. So that's a really interesting question, and I don't obviously know the answer. The questions I would have to ask to get to the answer are, well, if an EV battery catches on fire, is cobalt like released into the atmosphere? Are people going to breathe it in? Is that a toxicity? Right now, all I've really read about and dug into is how we get the cobalt, right? And that's the issue. But then the next issues too are those things, and even what happens with those batteries when we're done with them, and then where do they go? So it's not that different from the thought of, we used to mine silver, for example, and cobalt was a waste product of that mining. Well, now we want that cobalt from that slag, from those leftover products. Well, now we're going to have these batteries. What are we going to get from those leftover batteries later? Or is battery technology going to change and we're going to have solid state batteries instead of these ion batteries? So lots and lots of questions that I think are interesting. But I don't know what happens if one of those cars catches on fire. Do you? Am I?
Yeah, it's
No, I don't, no.
Okay.
yeah, so the other toxic stuff in the battery covers anyway. There's halogens in some, depending on there are different formulations. So I think it's safe to say they're probably toxic regardless of
I don't know if it would be the cobalt that was toxic,
Right,
the most toxic concern right at that point in time. But I don't have any idea.
I remember there was an article I was reading on CNN when they had the fire in Maui and a lot of on fire. The concern was that the cars generated a lot of toxic materials. And there was a little paragraph about EV cars. And at that time, it didn't say anything about cobalt or anything. Now, when you're saying this, it makes a lot of sense that maybe what Alyssa says as well, that there are a lot of other toxic materials exists, that it could be toxic to individuals.
I mean, there's no, what would be the term for that? There's no free pass. Like every solution we make to try and make the world better and healthier and safer and greener has its consequences too. And I think batteries are, I don't know.
I agree.
Yeah. So send me an email and remind me to look into the cars in the Hawaiian fires, so I can follow that story. Okay. Will you? Because I'll forget.
Sure.
I really want to thank everyone for their time and their input, and I'll take feedback for as long as you want to send it to me. This is fun because I get to have thoughts, like all of a sudden I got 16 things I want to go look up right now and figure out, and that's my job. And how fun is it that that's my job? So Thank you for your time, everyone. I really appreciate it. Thank you for letting me do
Thank
this.
you for a wonderful talk. One more round of applause. Thank you so much.